Be me, Megan, 34, head of HR. Tired of watching the same patterns play out every day. Men interrupting women in meetings, talking over us, using that commanding tone that makes everyone just automatically defer to them. It's systemic, and I'm going to fix it. Spend weeks drafting new communication guidelines. Call them professional communication standards. Specifically target what I define as aggressive male communication patterns. Things like speaking in declarative statements without hedging language, interrupting others or building directly off previous points without explicit permission, using definitive language like "we need to" or "this will" instead of "perhaps we could consider," taking up too much space in conversations, displaying confidence without sufficient deference to others' perspectives. Present it to the executive team. They look uncomfortable, but nobody wants to be the one to push back against HR diversity initiatives. CEO Rowan just nods along, probably calculating legal liability in his head. CFO David asks a few weak questions, but ultimately signs off. Even the other women executives seem hesitant, but don't voice concerns. Roll out the policy company-wide with mandatory training sessions. Explain how these communication patterns create hostile work environments, how they perpetuate systems of dominance that marginalize other voices, require all staff to use collaborative language and inclusive discourse patterns, set up reporting system for violations, feel so proud watching everyone take notes. Finally, a workplace where everyone's voice will be heard equally, where people can't just steamroll conversations with that typical aggressive energy. First week goes smoothly. People seem to be adjusting, speaking more carefully, fewer interruptions in meetings. I catch a few violations and send gentle reminder emails. This is working perfectly. Then things start getting weird. Tuesday morning, big client presentation. Our lead developer, Jake, stands up to begin. If it's okay with everyone, and I hope I'm not overstepping, but I was wondering if perhaps I might be permitted to possibly share what could potentially be considered our proposed technical solution, assuming that's appropriate and nobody objects. Client looks confused. Presentation takes 3 times longer than planned because every statement needs qualification and permission seeking. Client asks direct questions, gets rambling non-answers full of hedge words. We lose the contract. Rowan pulls me aside. Megan, what happened in there? Jake's normally our strongest presenter. Explain that Jake is learning to communicate in a less aggressive, more inclusive way. Rowan looks skeptical but doesn't push it. Things escalate quickly. Dev team can barely function. Simple code reviews turn into hour-long sessions. I'm sorry, and please forgive me if this comes across as presumptuous, but I was wondering if you might consider the possibility that this function could potentially benefit from optimization, though I certainly defer to your expertise and don't mean to suggest I know better. Nobody can give direct feedback anymore. Bugs start slipping through because no one will clearly identify problems. Accounting department falls behind on invoicing. Sarah from Accounts Payable spends 10 minutes asking permission before explaining basic billing issues. I hope it's appropriate for me to mention, and please stop me if I'm out of line, but there might possibly be some kind of issue with the Johnson invoice, though I could be completely wrong. Even simple email chains become nightmares. Every message hedged and qualified to death. Nobody can make clear decisions or give direct instructions. Productivity plummets. The women employees are following the rules too. Lisa from marketing can't even present campaign ideas without endless qualifiers. Jennifer from sales loses deals because she can't speak confidently about our services. They're interpreting aggressive communication patterns broadly and neutering their own effectiveness. I start getting complaints, but not the kind I expected. People aren't complaining about the policy itself. They're asking for clarification on the rules, requesting more detailed guidelines on acceptable language, wanting to ensure they're in full compliance. Rowan schedules emergency meeting with executive team, conference room full of hedge words and endless qualification. Perhaps we might consider the possibility that there could be some challenges with current operational efficiency, though I certainly don't want to suggest anyone is at fault. Nobody can have a real conversation. Meeting runs 3 hours and accomplishes nothing. Clients start noticing. Our biggest account asked why everyone sounds so uncertain and indirect. Competitor swoops in with confident presentation and steals the business. Revenue drops 30% in 6 weeks. Still getting reports of violations. Thomas from IT gets written up for saying the server is down instead of, I believe there might possibly be an issue with the server, though I could be mistaken. Rebecca from legal gets reported for using the phrase, we must comply with regulations, instead of requesting permission to share her legal opinion. The malicious compliance is perfect. Everyone's following the rules exactly as written. They're being scrupulously careful to avoid any language I defined as aggressive, requesting permission before speaking, hedging every statement, deferring constantly to others, never making definitive claims. But somehow this is backfiring. The office is chaos. Nothing gets done. People seem almost robotically compliant. There's this weird energy, like everyone's performing compliance rather than embracing it. Rowan calls me in for serious conversation. Megan, we need to talk about these communication guidelines. Productivity is down across all departments. We're losing clients. The team can barely function. Explain that this is just an adjustment period. Change is always difficult. We're dismantling harmful patterns that have existed for decades, short-term disruption for long-term equity. But people can't even answer direct questions anymore. Yesterday, I asked David for the quarterly numbers, and he spent 5 minutes asking permission to potentially share information that might be considered financial data. Tell Rowan that David is learning not to assume authority. He's being more collaborative and inclusive in his communication. This is exactly what we wanted. Rowan looks exhausted. No, Megan, this isn't what we wanted. We wanted better communication, not paralyzed communication. People are afraid to speak up in meetings. Decisions aren't getting made. We're hemorrhaging money. Suggests that maybe Rowan is uncomfortable with losing his traditional communication privileges. Maybe he's feeling threatened by more equitable discourse patterns. Rowan gets that look, the one men get when they're trying not to say something. Megan, I'm going to be very clear with you. These guidelines are causing serious operational problems. We need to revise them immediately. Notice he said, I'm going to be very clear. Classic aggressive male communication pattern. Write him up for violation of policy. Explain that his definitive language creates hierarchical power dynamics. He just stares at me. You're writing me up for telling you there's a problem with your policy. Explain that the way he's communicating is exactly what the policy addresses. He should have said something like, perhaps we might consider reviewing the guidelines if possible. Rowan suspends the policy pending review. Claim he doesn't have authority to unilaterally suspend HR diversity initiatives. Threaten legal action for creating hostile work environment. He backs down temporarily, but damage is spreading. Word gets out to other departments about the suspension attempt. People start speaking even more carefully. They're terrified of being accused of aggressive communication. Even asking for bathroom breaks becomes elaborate permission-seeking ritual. Client presentation disaster strikes again. Potential merger discussion with major partner. Our entire executive team speaks like they're apologizing for existing. We might potentially have some ideas that could possibly be worth considering, though we certainly don't want to presume to offer solutions. Partner executives look bewildered. They start asking direct questions about our leadership capability. Merger talks collapse. Board of directors gets involved. Emergency meeting called. I prepare detailed presentation on the importance of inclusive communication policies, legal necessity of addressing workplace discrimination, duty to create equitable environment. Board meeting is surreal. Executives can barely present quarterly reports. I'm sorry to potentially interrupt, but there might possibly be some financial information that could perhaps be relevant if sharing such data would be appropriate. Board members keep looking around like they're in alternate reality. Board Chair Eleanor finally speaks up. What exactly is happening here? Why is everyone speaking like they're afraid of their own shadow? Explain about the communication standards, how we're working to eliminate aggressive male discourse patterns, creating more collaborative workplace culture. Megan, I've been in business for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. People can't communicate basic information. How is this helping anyone? Tell Eleanor that dismantling patriarchal communication structures requires fundamental changes, that her resistance to new paradigms might reflect internalized biases. Eleanor is not having it. This isn't about bias, Megan. This is about basic functionality. You've created a situation where nobody can have a normal conversation. Explain that normal conversation often means privileging certain voices over others. We're expanding definitions of professional discourse. Board votes to suspend policy immediately. I object strenuously. Threaten discrimination lawsuit. Point out legal liability of suppressing diversity initiatives. They seem nervous, but hold firm. Walking back to office, everyone's still following the rules. They heard about board meeting, but are being extra careful about compliance. Tom from facilities asks 15-minute permission ritual before reporting broken copier. Jennifer from sales submits written requests to potentially discuss client concerns. Check email, dozens of messages, all following policy guidelines. I hope this message finds you well, and I sincerely apologize for potentially intruding on your time, but there might possibly be a situation that could perhaps benefit from your expertise. Though I certainly don't presume to know the appropriate protocol, every single employee is robotically following the communication guidelines. But somehow it's all wrong. They're weaponizing compliance, turning my carefully crafted policy into some kind of performance art. Rowan sends company-wide email suspending the policy. Employees respond with perfectly compliant messages. Thank you so much for potentially sharing this information, and please forgive me if this response is inappropriate, but I was wondering if you might clarify whether the suspension means we should perhaps consider returning to previous communication patterns, though I certainly don't want to assume anything. The malicious compliance continues even after suspension. People claim they're confused about which rules apply when. They want everything in writing. Demand training sessions on acceptable communication post-suspension. Insist on gradual transition period with detailed guidelines. Productivity remains destroyed. Clients continue fleeing. Internal operations completely dysfunctional. But everyone's being so perfectly, maddeningly compliant with my original vision. Rowan calls me in again. Megan, the policy is suspended. Why are people still communicating like this? Explain that changing communication patterns takes time. People are probably just being cautious during transition period. Suggest he's being impatient with necessary cultural shift. No, Megan. Look at this email from the dev team. It's 3 pages long, asking permission to fix a critical bug. 3 pages for something that should be a 5-word message. Critical bug, fixing it now. Point out that his suggested alternative uses aggressive declarative language. Exactly the kind of communication dominance the policy addressed. Maybe the dev team is being appropriately collaborative. Rowan looks like he wants to scream. Megan, the bug took down our entire client portal for 6 hours because nobody could get authorization to fix it through your communication maze. Suggest that having robust collaborative processes is more important than speed. Quality decision-making requires input from all stakeholders. What stakeholders, Megan? It's a bug fix. Someone needs to just fix it. Explain that just fix it mentality reflects hierarchical thinking. Dismisses collective wisdom and collaborative problem solving. Probably makes other team members feel excluded from technical decisions. Rowan puts his head in his hands. I can't even talk to you about this. You've turned basic workplace communication into some kind of theoretical exercise. Tell him that his frustration might reflect discomfort with more equitable communication structures. Suggest he consider why direct, efficient communication feels so important to him. Days pass. Chaos continues. Employees maintain perfect policy compliance despite suspension. They've formed committees to discuss appropriate transitional communication protocols. Every conversation requires consensus building and permission seeking. Decision-making process completely paralyzed. Accounting can't close monthly books because every entry requires collaborative discussion. Legal can't respond to urgent matters without stakeholder consultation. Sales team loses major client because proposal took 6 weeks to write collaboratively. I maintain that this proves how deeply embedded aggressive communication patterns were. The difficulty of transition shows how necessary the policy was. Temporary disruption is normal when challenging systemic inequities. Eleanor from board calls me directly. Megan, I need you to listen very carefully. The company is in crisis. We're losing money, clients, and credibility. This communication policy has to stop. Explain that rolling back progress on equity initiatives would send terrible message, could expose company to discrimination claims. Demonstrate lack of commitment to inclusive workplace. Megan, there's nothing inclusive about a workplace where nobody can communicate. You've created the opposite of what you claim to want. Tell Eleanor that her definition of communication might be too narrow. We're expanding possibilities for discourse beyond traditional power structures. Resistance to change often masquerades as practical concern. Eleanor goes silent for a long moment. Megan, I'm going to ask you directly. Do you think the current situation is working? Explain that defining working depends on your values and priorities. If you value speed and efficiency over inclusion and equity, then maybe it's not working. If you value dismantling harmful patterns and creating space for marginalized voices, then yes, it's working. Megan, there are no voices at all. Nobody can say anything. How is that helping marginalized people? Point out that absence of dominant voices creates opportunity for others to emerge. Silence from traditionally powerful speakers allows space for alternative perspectives. She's probably just uncomfortable with shifting power dynamics. Board meets again, votes to completely rescind policy and ban any similar initiatives. Threaten my position if I continue pushing communication restrictions. I document everything for potential legal action. Return to office. Employees still communicating in elaborate compliance patterns. They've now created formal protocols for post-policy communication. Require written requests to resume traditional discourse styles. Formed committees to evaluate appropriate transitional measures. The perfect malicious compliance continues. They're following the spirit of my policy even after it's banned. Constantly deferring, hedging, seeking permission, turning every interaction into collaborative performance art. Productivity remains completely destroyed. Rowan tries one more intervention, calls all hands meeting, stands up and says clearly, everyone needs to start communicating normally again. No more permission seeking, no more hedge words, just talk like regular human beings. Employees respond with elaborate requests for clarification. Could you perhaps define what might be considered normal communication? We want to ensure we're being appropriately collaborative. I watch this with mixture of vindication and frustration. They're proving my point about how deeply embedded these patterns are, but somehow they're also undermining everything I worked for. Their exaggerated compliance is making my policy look ridiculous. Weeks later, company starts hiring consultants to fix communication dysfunction. Consultants are baffled by what they find. Employees robotically following non-existent policy guidelines, requesting permission for basic job functions, hedging every statement to death. I get called into final meeting with Rowan and Eleanor. Megan, we need to understand what happened here. Why won't people just communicate normally? Explain that normal is subjective and culturally constructed. Maybe what they're seeing is people being more thoughtful about inclusive discourse. Resistance to change often creates temporary operational challenges. Megan, it's been 3 months. People are still asking permission to answer direct questions. This isn't thoughtfulness, it's paralysis. Suggest that their impatience with collaborative processes reveals attachment to hierarchical efficiency. Maybe they should examine why slow, consensus-based communication feels so threatening. Eleanor leans forward. Megan, I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you take any responsibility for what's happening in this office? Explain that change is always difficult. Dismantling systemic inequities requires sustained effort. Temporary disruption is normal when challenging established power structures. What about the employees who can't do their jobs? What about the clients we've lost? What about the money we're hemorrhaging? point out that those metrics reflect traditional values around productivity and profit. Maybe we should be measuring success differently, considering impact on workplace equity and inclusive culture. They look at each other. Rowan speaks quietly. Megan, you're fired. File wrongful termination claim. Document pattern of discrimination against diversity initiatives. Prepare case around retaliation for implementing equity policies. They've played right into my hands. Leave office while employees continue their elaborate compliance performance. Still requesting permission for basic communications. Still hedging every statement. Still creating committees for simple decisions. My policy lives on in their perfect, maddening adherence to its principles. Months later, hear through former colleagues that company eventually hired deprogramming consultant. Took nearly a year to get people communicating normally again. Massive financial losses. Several clients never returned. Legal fees from my lawsuit. But I know I was right. The resistance to my policy just proved how necessary it was. Their inability to adapt showed how deeply embedded toxic communication patterns had become. The chaos was evidence of systemic dysfunction, not policy failure. Now working at new company, already identifying problematic communication dynamics, planning more sophisticated approach to inclusive discourse policies. They won't catch me off guard this time. Some people just aren't ready for real change. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting for equity. Next time, I'll build better enforcement mechanisms, create clearer accountability structures, develop more comprehensive training programs. The work continues. Because dismantling patriarchal communication structures is too important to abandon, even when people maliciously comply their way into proving your point. Even when they can't handle the necessary disruption of meaningful change, especially when they blame you for their own resistance to growth. They showed exactly who they really were, and I showed exactly who I really am. Someone willing to fight for justice even when it's inconvenient. Even when people weaponize compliance to undermine progress. Even when they choose dysfunction over equity. Onward to the next battle.